in the interest of time, I think we must move on to our next presenter, who is Dr. Christian Christe, who is a classicist whose research is primarily centered on the history of the mid and late Roman Republic and the early Principate. He received his PhD from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, where he worked on a thesis on the social roles and emotional performances in late Republican judicial oratory. He's obviously also very interested in heavy metal and in emotions and social cultural context, and that's what he is here to talk about today. His paper is entitled "The Rivers of the Greek Underworld in Metal, Social Cultural Contexts, Emotions, and Political Agendas." And so I hand it over to our speaker.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I would like to speak about a particular aspect of Greek mythology, or more precisely about an aspect of the ancient Greek netherworld, namely the mythical rivers that encompass or flow through the realm of Hades, and how these rivers were adopted in metal. And to this end, I thought we'd start by undertaking a short journey along and across those rivers. I'll try to share my screen. Tell me if everything's okay, if you can see everything. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, it works.
So, in the bibliography, I've compiled a list of the main sources that reflect, or even in some cases shape, the ancient beliefs about the underworld. Now, I know that for a journey, a map would have been more appropriate, but the lack of it is simply due to the fact that the classical texts themselves cannot agree on how Hades exactly looked like. And this becomes obvious if we look at some of those texts. On the first slide, you can see a couple of the earliest relevant accounts about the geography of the underworld, going back to Homer's Odyssey, who holds that if we were to travel to Hades, we would first encounter the river Acheron, in which two other rivers, the Periphlegyton and the Cocytus, flow, the latter being a branch of the main stream, the Styx. About 300 years later, Plato mentions the same rivers, but rearranges them a bit. And what you can see here is the fact that one river, and that is one of the two rivers I'd like to talk about today, is actually missing from these early accounts. And this is the river Lethe, which turns out to be a later invention, being mentioned for the first time in the year 405 BC, if I'm not mistaken, by Aristophanes in his comedy, The Frogs. Now, ironically, the most detailed account originates from a Roman author, namely the Augustan poet Virgil, who in the 6th book of his Aeneid recounts the story of Aeneas' descent into Hades. And the first river he encounters there, and the actual entrance to Hades, is also the Acheron, where Charon ferries the dead souls across to the underworld, followed by the Styx, where it is Charon again who is responsible for the passage. Now, the interesting thing about this topic is that the ancient sources mention the ferryman in both contexts. He's either crossing the Acheron or the Styx, or, as in the case of Virgil, both of them. And this is pretty much a Greece versus Rome thing. So the Greek authors favor the Acheron. Virgil is taking quite a mediating stance, and the subsequent Roman authors mostly opt for the Styx. And why I think this is interesting is with regard to the question of the band sources, because you have some bands that have Charon on the Acheron and some that have him on the Styx. So this could tell something about the sources of that the band uses. Now, the realm of Hades is obviously a prolific source for metal bands with all its mythical figures and creatures, and especially because of its transgressive nature, which has led not only to individual songs, but also to entire concept albums dedicated on the topic. And this will be the second slide. This is, I'd like to point this out as an example. This is a South African black metal band Mirror, spelled M-Y-R-R-Y-R, who about 2.5 years ago has released an album called Relinquish All Hope, a name that, of course, draws its inspiration from Dante's famous inscription on the gates of hell. But however, as much as Dante's Divine Comedy is obviously a major source of inspiration, I believe that including it in the discussion will lead us too far. So I'm going to limit myself on the reception of classical tradition. And even within this tradition, I will narrow the focus on 2 of the 5 rivers that provide a good example of how classical mythology is embedded in current themes and how the metaphorical use of ancient topics appeals to the emotional imagery of the listener. And speaking of emotions, the idea of having particular feelings linked to the 5 rivers of Hades goes back to the earliest accounts, and it provides an entire narrative of emotional life, or rather emotional afterlife, in the sense that each river symbolizes an emotion that the deceased person experiences during his passing, and that hails from the etymology of the names of the rivers themselves. So we have Acheron as the river of sorrow, Lethe as the river of oblivion, Styx, the river of hatred, Cocytus, the river of lamentation, and the Pyriphlegethon as river of fire.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you, Christian.
Yeah.
Could you just make your PowerPoint full screen so that everybody can see a bit better, please?
All right, I'll just have to check on how this might, okay. Go with a slideshow, maybe it works. Yeah. Is it okay like this?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. So related to the emotional part, I would like to very briefly address a question of methodology, as I'll return to issues of method during my analysis of the band's lyrics. And in an article from 2016, Dina Weinstein has ascertained that, quote unquote, another problem with metal studies is that it is under-theorized and under-methodologized. Well, I think that it's obvious that since 2016, this has changed considerably. And I would name as an example the Metal Music Studies Journal and the articles concerning theory and method that appeared there. Regarding the methodology, I would like to point out 2 statements, one from Hede Savigny and Julian Schaap, who have advocated, quote unquote, methodological rigor, thinking about validity, reliability, and accountability rather than methodological determinism. And the second by Keith Kahn-Harris, I quote, the nightmare scenario for metal studies could be that it becomes a tiny insulated field that talks to itself, allowing certain theoretical and methodological tendencies to become orthodoxies that are difficult to contest. Now, I have picked out these quotations because I agree with the fact that in a highly interdisciplinary field, as in the case of metal studies, we shouldn't be too dogmatic about one or the other method. So my course of action in this paper represents merely one possible addition to the methodological repertoire of metal studies. And this course of action is based on the idea of culture as defined by Clifford Geertz as a, quote, as webs of significance, that the cultures themselves have spun, meaning that there is a cultural particularity to the perception of certain notions that hails from the visions and ideas of the respective culture itself. So one, in my opinion, extremely valuable addition to this, which has first been formulated by sociology, but in the meantime has also found its way into historical studies, is that certain feelings as well are dependent on the cultural perception of those notions that are related to the particular emotion. And what I mean by that, as I'll try to show later, is that, for example, the way a certain culture views death also affects the way emotions connected to death are experienced, or even if somebody does in fact relate one feeling or another to death at all. And I'm very grateful to Charlotte and Jeremy, who have pointed out this issue in the podcast introducing the conference, namely the fact that the way bands read classical authors and implement these texts into their own lyrics is not identical to the way a person in antiquity might have read or understood them. And obviously, a listener, a modern listener that does not share the same cultural experiences as the band might also misread or mishear the band's real intentions. So the worst case would be a misinterpretation of a misinterpretation. Now, the first band I would like us to take a closer look at is the Colombian death metal band Vitam et Mortem. And I would give a content warning at this point, as the bands I'm going to discuss in connection to the river Acheron often refer to very unpleasant stories of genocide and as well as another content warning later, but I will indicate this in due time. Now, the artwork on the left side stems from an album released in 2014 entitled Historias de Tiranía, Stories of Tyranny. And as you can see, the band has also broached the subject of colonialism in Latin American history. But also the phonic element plays an important role in the band's lyrics, obviously, in addition to the band's name and to the fact that Julian Trujillo, the singer of the band, also goes by the pseudonym Thanatos. The latest album, featured on the right, Rio de la Muerte, the River of Death, is the first one that systematically includes elements of Greek mythology in the lyrics. And topically, it is focusing on the entire history of violent conflicts in post-colonial Colombia, rather than on a particular episode. So the mythological metaphors are pretty much applied to the whole of the 20th century, starting with the 1920s over to the so-called La Violencia era in the 50s and up to the most modern drug wars. Now, the band has released a very interesting documentary about this album. I forgot to include it in the references, but I will update the file after the presentation. And in that documentary, Julian Trujillo also talks about the murder of his uncle in 2001. So the album has also a very personal and emotional touch to it. The artwork of the album shows the ferryman Charon, by the way, in a very accurate depiction of Virgil's account about his wretched looks, rowing the boat across a river that turns out to be the Acheron. As I've said, the ancient authors disagreed on whether Charon ferried the dead souls across the Acheron or the Styx, so Vitam et Mortem adopt the earlier Greek tradition on the matter. Being an album that is entirely dedicated to the River of Death, I would like to draw your attention to several songs instead of focusing on only one. Now, the most obvious choice to start with would, of course, be the song Acheronte. The River of Death in the title of album obviously alludes to the one that forms the entrance to the underworld, which is the Acheron. However, I would like to begin with two other songs that shed a light on the band's intentions and on how the Acheron metaphor is to be understood. The second song on the album is called Los Cuerpos en el Río, the corpses in the river. And here I would like to point out the first three strophes. But look how the corpses float in the river. Their come so bloated, the murdered pass and pass, so difficult to tell when you see the horror in their faces. A few years ago, the Magdalena River looked like a cemetery and like the path to hell. Like Charon in the boat, the death wandered, numbering in a long list the silent voices. So the river Vitam et Mortem allude to here is not the mythological Acheron, but an actual river, the Rio Magdalena, which is the main stream in Colombia. And Charon is not ferrying the bodies across the Acheron or even the Styx, but across a river that is tangible. Therefore, has its own history, its own meaning, and they are both rooted in reality, not in mythology. This idea is more clearly stated later in Barquero de los Muertos, Ferryman of the Dead. Guide me to Hades, guide of souls in sorrow. Take me, O Charon, to the dark and gloomy pit. Great guide, if you sail through Magdalena, from Honda to Cauca, eternal will be your task. Now, if the Acheron metaphor, or if the Acheron becomes a metaphor symbolizing the Rio Magdalena, the latter is at the same time endowed with all the characteristic traits attributed to the mythological river. And the main feature of Acheron is, of course, its identification as the river of sorrow, or the river of woe, which is reflected by the first verse of Acheronte, a river of tragedy. However, there is a second aspect that stands out in several other songs of the album. And if we look at how Acheronte continues, in your waters the corpses sink, or later, a river of the forgotten, ending with the corpses melt in your waters like breadcrumbs, men's remains become fish's food. Similarly, in Prayer to the Dead, the bodies ripped by bullets lie in pits in rivers, the death runs with violence, our history remains written in blood. To these, we can, of course, add the song Corpses in the River, which I've just showcased, and but obviously the sinking bodies are the main theme of the song. Now, as for the interpretation of this topic, we have to turn to mythology again. In his description of Acheron's shore, Virgil writes, all this crowd you see were destitute and unburied, that ferryman is Charon. Those the waves carry were buried, he may not carry them from the fearful shore and the harsh waters before their bones are at rest in the earth. They roam for 100 years and flit around these shores. Only then are they admitted and revisit the pools they long for. So the image of the unburied dead, or the ones that have not received the proper burial rites, is wandering along the river shores for 100 years, is also reflected by in a song by the Canadian band Beyond Within. Waiting in line to cross the 5 rivers to hell, caught in the glare of Charon, his lifeless finger points to me, you may not pass unless you pay the obol, wander through life, the underworld, 100 years. Now, if we are to relate this facet of the Acheron to the Rio Magdalena, the metaphor becomes even more clear. The Rio Magdalena is often linked to the violent conflicts in Colombia, being mentioned several times in the context of murdered civilians whose bodies have been thrown in the river. Hence, Vitam et Mortem add a further emotional layer to the metaphor of Acheron by providing a distinct definition to the so-called river of sorrow. So the sorrow stems not only from the unfortunate fate of the victims, but also from the circumstances of their death, and especially from the analogy with the ancient beliefs that the unburied are destined to wander the shores for 100 years without the prospect of finding peace. A somewhat different, but also in many regards similar narrative is to be found in the lyrics of the most renowned Taiwanese band, Thonic. This band is obviously not only renowned for pioneering Taiwanese metal, having played at the Wacken Festival, for example, but also for its political activism. So Freddie Lim, the singer of the band, currently holds a seat in the Taiwanese parliament. He was the chairman of Amnesty International Taiwan from 2010 to 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And he's one of the leading advocates of Taiwanese independence. Now, these topics also feature prominently in Thonic's lyrics, and I've picked out a song featured on their 2000 album, Ninth Empyrean. Now, the remarkable thing about the song is that it combines elements of Taiwanese history and mythology with stories of the ancient Greek underworld. More exactly with the topic of Acheron, as can be seen in the English translation of the lyrics. Cold winds chilled me from skin into bone. Across the water, my soul melted into Acheron. Surrounded by Acheron, my body floated. In the Acheron, all dead soul floats. Things spread all over dead God seemed alive. My heart ached with anxieties. Looked at the Acheron, where did it flow? Floated on the Acheron, where did I go? So the song floated unconsciously in the Acheron, as actually the entire album, retells the story of the wars between the Taiwanese and Chinese armies during the time of the Han Dynasty. And in this respect, the victims that float in the Acheron in Thonic songs differ slightly from those who have been cast in the Rio Magdalena. They are the soldiers of a defeated army, and therefore the emotional undertone shifts from the original sorrow represented by Acheron to feelings of hatred and rage, as we can see in the lyrics, especially in the last 2 strophes of the song. However, the perception of Acheron in both Vitam et Mortem and Thonic shows many similarities. As a metaphor, the Acheron is located in the mortal world, becomes a symbol for a river or a place that illustrates certain events, and it conversely endows these events with a high degree of mythological symbolism. In this sense, it receives a political dimension, as both bands bewail the sorrows of the oppressed, be it as civilian victims of war or as soldiers defeated by an invading army. So the metaphorical Acheron retains the negative emotions experienced in life or through death, like sorrow, but also hatred or rage. But it nevertheless entails a positive view on life itself, in the sense that it's not an expression of escapism, even though it laments reality, obviously. At the same time, this take on Acheron comes to show how the emotional experiences put forward by a band, especially if connected to episodes from history, are often related to the cultural background and the self-image of the respective band. For example, listening to Vitam et Mortem or Thonic as a non-Colombian or non-Taiwanese person, we might be able to understand the meaning of the lyrics, maybe even of the metaphors, but it is highly improbable that we can appraise the exact emotional message conveyed, as long as we do not share the same background or the same cultural experiences. So from the point of view of emotional history, we're dealing with a reception of a reception that has taken into account both layers, and obviously also the fact that the band itself is probably adopting the myths in a different form than intended by the original texts. We also encounter a different view on the Acheron metaphor in the works of 2 other bands, the gothic metal band Ion from Poland and the melodic death metal band Path of Debris from Germany. As a short side note, the song The Black River by Ion was originally released in 1993 by a band called Miracle, also a Polish band. And the writer of the song goes by the name Witalis Jagodziński, is a co-founder of Ion. So I've depicted here the song by Ion. It's not a cover song in that sense. So that's why I stuck with this version and not with the, let's say, original. Now, from an emotional standpoint, these bands exhibit a rather hopeful and expectant view on crossing the Acheron. For Ion, for example, the sad face slowly disappears when entering deeper into Hades, while the river that, quote unquote, cuts the world into halves, separate the living, who, according to the lyrics, believe in lies, from the dead, to which is revealed that, quote unquote, the light is not everything. Similarly, Path of Debris speak of a journey to cease the pain of life and to end agony. Now, in, let's say, more melancholic lyrics or subgenres, such as gothic metal and to a certain degree also melodic death metal, the river of sorrow earns a positive connotation. If the world in itself is filled with sorrow, or as Ion says, if light is not everything, then the Acheron can only symbolize the last moment of sorrow, or more precisely, while bands like Vitam et Mortem endow actual rivers with mortal sorrows, Ion and Path of Debris change the perspective and use the Acheron as a metaphor for leaving the sorrows behind. And this is a pattern one can also encounter in the songs concerned with Lethe, as we will see shortly. And it might not be a coincidence that Path of Debris end their song with falling into oblivion and escaping from memory's punishment. Now, obviously, there are also other layers of symbolism attached to the river Acheron. For example, one can often find the crossing of the river in the opposite direction, as being the river that separates the mortal world from the underworld. It is in this case used as a metaphor for resurgence, mainly in conjunction with chthonic deities or demons, pagan deities, or even Satan himself entering the mortal world. Regarding the river Lethe, as I've said, a similar pattern as in the case of the positive reception of Acheron can be seen as predominant. The song Lethe by the Swedish melodic death metal band Dark Tranquillity envisions an entire journey through the river of forgetfulness, which starts with a painful resurfacing of memories only to be gradually eliminated. Hence the burning memories, sharp steps of pain, burning, shuddering, ultimately lead to the liberation from the quote unquote life that I hate. Or in Dark Tranquillity's words, cleansed through a floodlight, I appear reformed and renewed, caressed by the sweet balm and blessing of forgetfulness, empty and strong. The same view is advocated by bands like Ferdirial or Ancestral Legacy. For example, to Ferdirial, forget and be forgiven also represent the only path to liberation and salvation. And in the case of Ancestral Legacy, we also witness the personification of Lethe, which is directly addressed, much like in Dark Tranquillity song as well, and in the other two parts of the Lethean trilogy by Ancestral Legacy. Now, the band Internal Torment from Colombia offers an interesting change of perspective, which is nevertheless still connected to a favorable or at least soothing perception of Lethe. The song is written from the point of view of the surviving partner that mourns the loss of his lover. However, it ends by asserting that there is no turning back, and thus drinking the water of Lethe appears as the only way to peacefulness for the deceased. Now, as I've said, the use of metaphor in the way we have seen in the last 4 examples is by far the predominant one. The idea of forgetfulness is mostly employed in the sense of liberation from earthly pain, and thus mainly used in songs that display a deep melancholy. But in spite of this, let's say, general consensus, the topic is worth mentioning from the standpoint of reception studies, as it shows a complete inversion of the classical imagery. The Greek religion, at least in its common form, valued mortal life and was, by and large, terrified by the realm of Hades. And the emotions attached to the 5 rivers were therefore perceived as exclusively negative. Obviously, if mortal life is valued, forgetfulness must entail the loss of all memory of joyful things too. And indeed, the ones that drank from the Lethe are often depicted by the ancient authors as confused, dull, or shallow. However, there is one exception, and I believe this exception to be important, especially in connection with metal studies. This picture is displayed on the website of the British Museum, and it depicts a so-called Orphic gold tablet, so-called because there are still lots of questions regarding its origin in the Orphic cult. Some see it as Pythagorean, some as Dionysian. Apart from that, we still don't know exactly how to define the ancient Orphics, if it was a homogeneous group or not, and so on. And I will not get into these questions. What is, however, relevant is that all these cults were somehow interrelated and formed some sort of counterculture to traditional Greek beliefs. One of the aspects of this counterculture was its rather optimistic view on death, in the sense that they believed in being able to break the cycle of rebirth and spend a, let's say, happy afterlife. And to this end, they introduced the idea of a lake of Mnemosyne, which was the Greek goddess of memory, a lake from which the dead should drink instead of Lethe in order to retain their memory and avoid wandering confused through Hades. This is the translation of the text from one of these tablets, which was pretty much a guide that the deceased carried into the afterlife. This is the work of memory. When you are about to dive into the well-built halls of Hades, there is a spring on the right, and beside it stand a white cypress. There souls of the dead descend and refresh themselves. Do not go anywhere near this spring, meaning the spring of Lethe. Further on, you will find cold water flowing forth from the lake of memory, and there are guardians over it. These will ask you with their sharp wits, what are you seeking in the darkness of gloomy Hades? Say, I am a child of earth and starry sky, and I am parched with thirst and dying, but grant me quickly to drink cold water from the lake of memory. If we put this in the context of the well-known quote by Dina Weinstein, who has determined two antithetical clusters as themes for metal lyrics, death, the underworld, and hell seem to belong exclusively to the chaotic cluster. Now, this might be true from the standpoint of the themes she assigned to the Dionysian cluster: sex, drugs, and, well, praise of metal instead of rock and roll. However, if we look at it from the point of view of two opposing clusters, a perception of the afterlife, such as that of the ancient Orphics, meaning a joyful afterlife, contrasts the definition of death as part of the chaotic cluster as given by Weinstein herself. And I quote, "Death is the extinguishing of relations. Since order means relationship among things, death is the ultimate chaos." So if death is not an act of transgression anymore, or of a rejection of the world, then the joys of life must become the expression of a Dionysian attitude. And indeed, there are some rare instances of metal bands that prefer memory over forgetfulness, as can be seen in the lyrics of the Greek band Lucky Funeral, who urge Mnemosyne to keep them far from Lethe when, quote unquote, bodies return to soil. Now, before I conclude, I would like to briefly showcase two further examples of how the praise of memory in metal can look like. And I would like to issue.
I'm really sorry, Chris. We're running quite short on time. So if you could skip to the conclusion, that would be very good. Otherwise, there's no time for questions.
No, this actually would be my conclusion. I just wanted to give a content warning. I want to give a content warning before that, because I'm going to show the lyrics of a nationalistic and xenophobic band, and these are the two examples I wanted to show. The band Shadow Order, who in a very nostalgic way bemoans the loss of proud eagles, heathen gods, and so on, and concludes that pride has turned to humiliation. There's nothing else to lose. Now everything is shattered to oblivion, dying in the arms of Lethe. So on the one hand, retaining the memory can mean remembering a presumably better past from a radical and right-wing extremist point of view, but it also can mean the exact opposite, namely the fact that the memory is desirable precisely as a means to remember the crimes and atrocities of the past, as shown here by the German band Phantom Winter, who linked the idea of forgetfulness to forgetting the Holocaust. The number 6 followed by 6 zeros is obviously the number of the victims of the Holocaust, and therefore they show no acceptance for the Lethe. Well, I hope that this quick summary of the various forms in which Lethe has been perceived in metal has shown how different mentalities can shape the emotional assessment of a certain metaphor. For example, the difference between the life affirmative stance of the ancient Greeks and the inversion in the melancholic lyrics of some bands, but also how different takes on Lethe inform us about the self-image of various subgenres in metal, from doom, gothic, melodic death metal, all the way to neo-fascist subcultures and so on. Well, thank you. This will be all.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really wide-ranging, and you covered so many interesting tracks that are unfortunately unknown to me, but they will be known later. We have time for one or two very quick questions before we have to move on. Sorry, time is always running. We have one question here. Seeing how memory and nostalgia can be both weaponized by the far right while also valued and reinterpreted by other and more progressive bands, where do you foresee the future of metal music covering the rivers of the underworld?
This is a difficult question because I actually see a predominance of the right-wing interpretation of Mnemosyne. So what I've shown from Phantom Winter is actually a great exception to that. And I could have shown other bands, but they would have been irrelevant, that use this memory in the sense of let's get back our past. And this mostly comes from the right-wing corner. But that's why I do not mean to be grim, but I do not foresee a positive future for Mnemosyne.
Okay, well, sorry to hear that, but okay. But what can you do?
I was just being honest.
Yeah, that's great. That's what we want. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your paper.